بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to continue in our reading of the book Al-Maqasid for Imam Al-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala. So, if we can quickly go back to what we talked about in this second objective, just as to remember the cases. And they're very important. So first we talked about the issue of water and the types of water. So we talked about absolute pure and purifying water. We talked about used water. We talked about water that is changed with a pure substance. We talked about water that is affected by a najis. We talked about the amounts of water in the Shafi'i school. We talked about water that is disliked to be used. Then we talked about an-najasa and its types and how to purify an-najasa, whether it is a light najasa or a medium najasa or a dense najasa. We also talked about containers and what is lawful to use among them and what is unlawful to use among them, what is disliked. We talked about when we are not sure if a container or a garment is najis and what to do about that. We talked about the sunnah matters or the recommended matters of a siwak. We talked about those things which nullify al-wudu. We talked about the obligations of al-wudu. We talked about the recommended matters of wudu. We talked about wiping over the footgear. We talked about its invalidators. We talked about al-istinja. We talked about the things that nullify al-ghusl. We talked about the obligations of ghusl. We talked about the sunan of ghusl. We talked about when the ghusl is sunnah. We talked about at-tayammum, its conditions. We talked about its integrals, and we talked about its recommended matters and its invalidators. And we left off talking about at-tayammum must be renewed for every obligatory prayer, inshallah ta'ala. So keep all those matters, because in every level of the books of al-fiqh, we're going to expand on those matters. So each text gives us a level. We go from one text to another text to another text, as we mentioned. As a quick review, do any of you remember when we study books, we mention in al-fiqh, and even in aqidah and other sciences, but especially when we're talking about al-fiqh, we talked about three categories or three ways of books, the way they're explained. So we mentioned three levels. When you get any book, usually those books in fiqh go to three levels. Do any of y'all remember what they are? And we said that usually when you study a book, you study it 3 times. So we mentioned like how those 3 types are. Does anyone remember? Excuse me, I'm trying to be healthy. Close, 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 Malika, that's close, but not, you added something and left out something else. So Sister Malika has the hint. She's close. One second. Mm, not quite, Brother Nadir. Mm. No one remembers. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Come on. Good, Isa. That's true. Okay. Now all you need to do is give me that in Arabic. Isa is correct. But now give me that in Arabic. How do we say that in Arabic? So, yeah, metin, right? So you have, that should be a T, right. Uh, so fix it, Isa. Metin should be Matn, and then you're correct. And put a capital on the H. Uh, so fix it, Isa. So put a T on metin and capitalize the S on sharh. And then hashia is right. So you have, right, as Isa put it, so all of you can copy that. Whenever you studying in fiqh, usually the main books of any school, right, the main books of any school, you're going to have a metin, then you're going to have a sharh, then you're going to have a hashia, right? The metin is going to be a basic text. The metin of any book is usually summarized. So the metin is usually a summary, mukhtasar. So the mukhtasar is the actual metin, right? Then that metin is explained, which is a sharh, is a commentary. Then that commentary is given marginal notes, which is called al-hashiyah, or you can say a super commentary, right? And every madhab has this format, right? Even in other books, in Creed, we have those type of books, right? So, Asa, are you Shafi or Maliki? I ain't gonna take it out on you. Which one are you, Shafi or Maliki? So all Maliki. I'm not gonna blame you, right? So, like in the Maliki madhab, you're gonna have the same thing. So, like you have the famous text, Muqtasar Khalil, right? And then you have the commentary on that, Ashar al-Kabir, right? By Imam Dardir. Then you have a hashia on that by Imam al-Dasuki, right? And others. Uh, so you have these levels of books. And every book you have, you're going to have a commentary, and then someone's going to come do a hashia on that book, right? In the Shafi school, we have the same thing. In the Hanbali school, in the Hanafi school, there's the same thing. And this is a way that books are built upon. Every time you have a metin, so let's get this in our mind. Whenever you have a metin, the objective of the author of that metin was to summarize so that it could be memorized, right? So usually in every school, a famous book, the metins are memorized by seekers of knowledge. So they all memorize the metin. That's like a given, right? Then with those mutun that they have, those texts they have in their mind, they go to their teachers and the teachers explain those, explain the terms of that text. Maybe sometimes giving evidence, maybe not. Maybe just explaining the words without actually giving the text. When you get to those super commentaries, and in some explanations, you're going to start finding evidences for the legal rulings that were mentioned in the text. That's how Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah studies, right? So let me repeat that so you keep it in your mind. Because ultimately, our intention is to get us to learn how to properly learn the religion, right? In the traditional Sunni way. So I'm explaining all these things to you so that wherever you go and study, right? Wherever you go, you already know the format of the school itself, right? So once you know that, then you know how to take knowledge, right? You know you're going to work on the text. You're going to sit with the sheikh or the teacher, and they're going to explain. Then, after you get to explain, you're going to do further research on the cases that are mentioned, which is really like the purpose of a hashia, right? So it's like the formal way you study. You have a basic text, you learn the basics of the subject, the foundational matters of that subject. Then you go with the teacher explains to you the terms so that you make sure you're not misunderstanding them. Then that teacher may provide you with some evidences, some details. And then from there, you go to the more complicated discussions of those cases by the scholars of the school, which is in the Hawashi, in those super commentaries. And this is the methodology. So even when you study, you should study in that kind of manner, right? When you're doing your own private studies, that's how you should study, the same way you learn. So I gave you 5 steps of studying. Does anyone remember them? I gave you like 5 stages to study from beginning to your end, the way you're supposed to study a book or a text, a metin, for you as a student. So what did we say? Do y'all remember those 5 steps? See who remembers the 5 steps. I mentioned to them last week, and I mentioned them before, but I think I mentioned them last week as well. Yeah, but that's not really a part of it. Tahira. We said read the book 3 times, but that's in general. But we talking about the actual steps. So then go back and read it again. Okay. right? That's number one, right, Malika? So you read the text alone by yourself first, right? What's the next? Then, number two, you go to the lesson with the teacher in class, book, notebook, pen, and paper. Go ahead. Three, good, Malika, you took good notes. Review, organizing, spending as much time after the class as in class, studying and editing the notes. Four, good, very good. So then you teach that and you convey it to someone else, right? Right? And one last step, 4 and 5 can be interchangeable, but 4 will help you before you do 5. And 5 is what? And 5 is that you write out your own explanation from yourself. So number 5 is that you write out your own explanation from yourself without using anything, right? You write out what you understand from the masail, from the cases. If you do this for every book you learn, you'll be a master. It's a lot of work, but our teachers mentioned that if you do that for every book, you won't really have to go over it 3 times. If you do it through the whole time you're studying, at every section, when you finish the book with the teacher, you won't need to go back to that book again. And that's how you should study them, because they say you should study the book as if you're never going to return to it, even though you know you're going to return to it. But the way you study, if you do that, it will be like I never need to read that book again. Right? So let's review those 5 things again quickly. This is really important. It's just as important as what we're actually doing, how to do it. So the first thing, the methodology of learning and studying, should we say, right? Number one, a structure for studying is before the lesson, read the book on your own, being prepared. So I usually, as I told you yesterday, and I've get into this habit since then to make sure you're able to do this, I usually tell you how much material we may cover in the next class so that you read ahead, right? Right? Or before we start a book, tell you read the first 10 pages. So whatever. And in a way, you don't have to actually just read what the teacher mentioned. So at the first level, for instance, so we read in Al-Maqasid. So we're talking about at-tayammum, right? So I could read pages 28 and 29, right? For instance. So I'm going to read about at-tayammum, al-hayd, and an-nifas, right? Now I'm going to read that before class, before I go study with the teacher. I'm going to go over it, go over it, go over it. And if I can read more, I'll read ahead as much as I can comprehend, but definitely what is going to be covered in the lesson at minimum, right? But if you read a couple chapters ahead, then you're already familiar. I would read that at least 3 times, right? So since we're talking small right now, before every class, I would read the next 3 chapters in the book, right? Each of them 3 times. No, 1 and 2 should not be switched. 1 first, 2 second. Because number 1 is just getting you to know what's being talked about. None of this is for at stage of 1 for you to convey. It's only for you to read and understand what's being talked about. Number one will lead you to number two. So let's take number one first. Number one, if you do number one, when you go to class, you're not in space. You actually know what the teacher is talking about at the first stage because you actually know. So he talked about dry ablution, tayammum, or right, right. So you know what a tayammum basically is. When you do step number one, you're going to have questions because you're not going to understand everything, right? You're going to mark those questions. I didn't understand this. I didn't understand that, right? When you go, so that's first level. So you read and then you mark down what is unclear to you from just your reading, right? What I didn't understand. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? For instance, you jot that down. That stage is done. Read it at least 3 times, right? Read the sections that you're preparing yourself for the class at least 3 times, right? If you're good, you should try to memorize, right? So that's the text. Memorize the text, right? Now, that first stage is done, right? The second stage, now you attend the class, which is stage number 2. Let me go up to stage number 2. Second stage, to attend the lesson with a teacher. So you have the book that you're studying, you have your notebook, and you have your pen. And you have those things, those questions you marked down from your own reading, what you didn't understand. While you're listening to the class, you will notice most likely whatever you didn't understand, the teacher explained it. So you can fill in that from your notes, right? So when you read, for instance, you didn't understand what dry ablution was. What is meant by that? When the teacher was explaining, he mentioned it, you mark it down. So that question's answered. So you don't have to ask it. You already got it because you prepared ahead of time and the question was answered in the class when the teacher was explaining. And then you're adding the notes that he's given because it's explanation that you didn't have for the whole of what you covered. Sometimes the teacher may not even explain some things. They're clear, right? Or he didn't even talk about it. And you would notice from that you didn't get that explanation and it wasn't fully clear. You may note that down, right? So the class, now you're actively engaged in the class like we're doing now, right? So you're taking a bunch of notes, right? Then after the class, you got the third stage, right? Review and organize your notes. And you're going to spend as much time after the class as you did in the class studying and editing your notes. So if the class is 1 hour, you're going to spend a minimum of 1 hour reviewing that class. And what is good about like what we're doing is you can always go back to the video and make sure you wrote correctly because sometimes your notes may be incorrect or the teacher may have had a slip of the tongue. When you review, you'll notice that, whoa, he said this. Let me go back and check. And then you'll mark that this needs to be clarified, right? Because teachers make mistakes. You know, they're human beings, right? So you may notice that from your review. You'll catch the slips or the errors or the mistakes or the incorrect sayings, right? So now you'll notice from step 1 to step 2, step 3. Step 3, you have a lot more information than when you started just reading on your own. Now you have a greater comprehension of the text or the material you're covering, right? Now, that teacher has supplied you level number 2, the metin, the explanation. Then after that, you're going to go to the 4th level, which is very important. Our 4th level was always, we would sit with other students and somebody would teach the text, the explanation of the sheikh, and their notes, right? Because for us, there is another stage at number 3, but you might not have access to that. At number 3, after reading, you would go to the super commentaries or different explanations, and you would note those explanations. So you study with your teacher. Then there are other books, right, and other scholars who explain that same thing your teacher explained. You would go read them and research in them, and then you would mark. And then from that, sometimes you're going to find where your teacher actually got his information from, right? This is like more advanced, but probably we don't have access to that because we're studying in English. So in English, unfortunately, we just have the book. In Arabic, you'll have different explanations of that text, right? The books usually, or books where that text was summarized from. So you have access to more stuff. That's just Arabic language because more was written in Arabic. Then you would be making those notes at that 3rd level. At the 4th level is really supposed to be collective work between the students. So you would have your fellow students, y'all would study together, review together, but one would be teaching. So I would teach this section and explain it and give it. Then the other student would take the other section, another section, or even the same section from his way of explaining, because everybody doesn't explain the same. In this way, the material is being reviewed together with someone else. So you're able to actually explain and you hear explanations, right? Sometimes you benefit greatly from your other students who actually learned and they highlighted something that you didn't highlight, right? Or something was significant to them that you might have overlooked, right, in your note taking. So they say in this case, if you have no one, you can have your wife, your husband, your kids, your neighbor, your friend, fellow students. Find someone to convey that information to. Then, after you do that, the last level, I don't think no one put number 5. The 5th level is to actually write the material. No, that wouldn't be, because the student already knows not to make judgment question from Tanweer. Would that be problematic if a person did not learn the rules of apostasy? Read ahead. Let me explain something to you. Only in certain books, if you study Shafi'i fiqh or any fiqh properly, you won't even get to the section of apostasy towards the end of the book. That's not how scholars teach. When you study, and traditionally you don't study the rules of apostasy. You study Aqidah, they teach you the correct belief. They don't teach you the rules of apostasy. You don't learn the rules of apostasy till you study fiqh. So the books that we mention that contain apostasy, those scholars wrote those books for specific things in specific areas. It wasn't like a general thing that was the way of studying. That's not the way it was. And the evidences of it, if you study real Shafi'i fiqh or Hanafi fiqh or Maliki fiqh or Hanbali fiqh, and you study all the major books of fiqh, you won't find the section of apostasy first. It's at the end of the books, towards the end of the books, right? In the subjects of al-fiqh. And when you study, that's how you study. Even when you study the books of Aqidah, true books of Ahl Sunnah, you don't find apostasy. That's a fiqh issue. That's not an issue of creed. You don't learn it like that. I'm talking about the proper way to study. Whenever you see that these books have apostasy in them, that is for a specific case, that author was talking about specific things, right? It's not general. That every Muslim immediately needs to learn the rules of apostasy. That's never been the way of Sunni Muslims as a general practice of learning. Most Muslims you're going to meet around the world, they don't know unless they studied the rules of apostasy. They won't know that until later. They know the correct belief, but all those cases of apostasy, they didn't learn them. And none of our scholars, of the major scholars of our books, will you ever find that. Not one. That's just a fact, right? So we shouldn't make the exception the rule, right? An exception doesn't become the rule, right? If the cases are so severe, you may mention that exception. But in normal learning, the exception is not given. It's just the rule. Does that make, if you understand what I'm saying, does that make any sense? Do y'all understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying apostasy is not important. It's not the first thing the person learns. The person learns the correct creed first. If you learn the correct creed and then you continue to learn the rules, you won't be falling into apostasy. Right? But now when kufr is spread, so you deal with those cases. Those cases that you see have spread, you deal with those cases, not extra cases that are not the case. You learn it in its form, right? If you wanna get an example of that, go look at, let me give you an example just for a point. Hold on. So if you look, where's my glasses? I put them down. So if you look, for instance, one second. Like the first major book that most of people would study is Matan Abi Sujar, right? Right? So this would be like the first full book of the sacred law, because the books we're studying now are just dealing with ibadat. When we get to the full sacred law, when we talk about the whole of the sacred law of al-fiqh, the first book usually in the Shafi'i school you're going to study is Muqtasar Abi Suja or Matan Abi Suja, which is a text. If you look at it, you'll see that when you get to a ridda, right? If you look, you see this is a ridda. You see, you're on page 154. If you notice, there's only 179 pages in the book. Where does Ridda come? Way towards the end, right? Page 154, right? Or 153, right? Page 153. But before that, you have all these sections of the rules of the religion. And when you learn, you don't start with apostasy. Give you example. So that's that. Here's to Salad, reliance of the traveler. That would be your next level, right? If you want to shortcut, right? And you'll see you don't touch Ridda to page 479, right? That's at the end of the books, right? You have so many other things you must learn, right? Before you touch those subjects. So and these are the classical fiqh books. Everyone who learns Shafi'i fiqh will, and even if you go up to Al-Minhaj, right? The same thing. You're not going to touch that to the end of the book, right? That's how fiqh texts work, right? So for us, why am I mentioning this? Because I was asked a question, right? But we've been duped. And when I say that, people haven't taught us properly. And what we're trying to do is learn our religion in a proper manner, where we don't end up with some strange practices that people just reject because a certain group of people told us something, which is very important. And that's been happening to us. So for us, we're just trying to learn what is the traditional Sunni way for real, and then stick to it, right? So those books that are written, and there are not many, very few books are written like that, right? The books that are written like that were written by scholars who were trying to protect a certain thing, right? So, for instance, there are two books I'll show you. There are two books. This book, right? It is an explanation of Sulam at-Tawfiq. So Sulam at-Tawfiq was written by Abdullah bin Hussein bin Tahir. So he was in Hadramaut and in Tarim area. And in that time, a lot of the people, right, in this summary book, a lot of the people were falling into blasphemous sayings and things. So he mentioned it. In the section after dealing with Aqidah, he mentioned it. But his book is not a full book of Islamic law. It is just specific obligatory parts that he wanted the common people to know. So he authored this book. But he put just the section of apostasy in there to prevent what was going on. And his student was the Mufti of Mecca. He wrote this book, and he was his teacher, Abdullah bin Al-Habib, Abdullah bin Hussein bin Tahir, sent him to Tarim to teach, because Tarim was like, people left, the scholars left. It was a bunch of fitna in that time. Rulers and everything. So he sent his student, which is Al-Habib Muhammad bin Hussein Al-Habashi, who was the mufti of the Shafi'is in Mecca. He sent him to Turin to teach, right? And in his book, he added to that as he was teaching, excuse me. He added that section again in the beginning of his book, which is that same section, right? But look what he said, right? It's backwards, so I can't really see, right? He said, وَقَدْ كَثُرَ فِي هَذَا الزَّمَانِ التَّسَاهُلُ فِي الْكَلَامِ حتى أنه يخرج من بعدهم ألفاظ تخرجهم عن الإسلام ولا يرون ذلك ذنبا فضلا عن كونه كفرا. And look what he said. He said, I'll go to the beginning of it. It's obligatory on every Muslim to protect his Islam from what spoils it, invalidates it, or cuts it off. And namely, it is apostasy. And we seek refuge in Allah Azza wa Jal from that. Now, listen why he's putting this there. It has become common in this time to be free or careless in speaking. Tasahul means you don't watch what you say, right? Until some people say things that take them out of Islam, and they don't even see it sinful despite that thing being disbelief. So he's talking about a case. Now, if you understand what was going on, you understand why he said that. But let me add to that. When he went to Turin to teach the people, his book that he taught the people was Fathul Mu'in, which is a Shafi'i fiqh book. And in Fathul Mu'in, that's the regular classical fiqh book, it has the sections of apostasy at the end of the book. But that was the main book that they wrote, and they wrote it in his time by hand because they didn't even have books. They copied it out by hand. So this was a book he was given to the common people to warn them. But when he was teaching the major books of Shafi'i fiqh. Do y'all follow my? I'm just giving you, like, sometimes there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know. And unfortunately, which gets to be frustrating, is people ain't told us. They just told us what they want us to know. And then put a battery in our back and we just go without really knowing that we've been duped, right? So I'm saying all that to say we have to learn. And that's a stage. Listen, we all are in the same boat and we all need the same paddles. We all in the same boat and we all need the same paddles. So number 5, that 5 point, I said all that to answer that question. Number 5 is that after you did all that, you actually write that stuff out from your mind, right? If you do that for every lesson, by the time you finish, you won't be confused. So as we're doing Al-Maqasid, inshallah, let us do that. Let's finish this last section. Let's finish this last section in for the bandages. Quickly, we'll read through it, inshallah. Al-Fatiha to the soul of Imam An-Nawawi, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Al-Fatiha.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said, dry ablution, tayamun for injuries. 2.
Tayammum.
Tayammum, excuse
And
me.
there's a saying among the scholars, إذا حضر الماء بطلت التيمم, right? When water comes, tayammum is not valid. And they use that as a saying is when you have a scholar, then you no longer need uh, teachers by necessity, right? So look at us as a tayammum, and one day we're going to need pure water, right? We need pure water. But when pure water comes, we don't need a tayammum anymore, right? So let's develop some pure water among our children that become real scholars, that memorize, that did all that stuff, and they're like walking books. Then we can sit down and learn from them. We're just right now in temporary dry ablution for us. May Allah make us, at least we still can do our act of worship. Mm.
2.26. If one has a bandage or cast, per translator, on a part of the body normally washed in ablution, a dressing that one cannot remove without causing oneself harm, one wipes it with water. Per reliance of the traveler, when one comes to it in the ablution sequence, in addition to performing a complete dry ablution, per translator at that point. One need not later make up prescribed prayers performed with such an ablution, provided that one had ablution when the bandage or cast was first applied, per translator, and that it does not cover more than necessary to hold it in place, and provided also that it is not on the face or arms as discussed next. From reliance of the traveler, when someone with such a bandage on the members of dry ablution, the face or arms, recovers and has his cast or dressing removed, he is obliged to make up, repray all the prayers he performed with such an ablution.
So here, there is an important point. Whenever you have to have a cast uh, that is on the areas that you must perform ablution, if you put that cast on with a complete ablution, it's fine, right? You can wipe over the cast, right? If it has a complete ablution before it. Now, go ahead.
The Hanafi school requires someone with an injury who wants to pray to make a complete ablution or bath, or ghusl, if needed. But if this would entail harm, per the translator, one of the things mentioned above at 2.21a, then when he comes to the injury in the ablution sequence, he is merely required to wipe it with wet hands so as to cover more than half of the injury. If this would also entail harm, or if he has a bandage that cannot be removed without harm, or he cannot reapply the dressing by himself and has no one to help him do so, then he simply wipes more than half the bandage when he comes to it in his ablution. He may pray with such an ablution and need not repeat the prayer later. El Hadiyah al Alaiyah,
Mhm.
per translator, provided his prayer fulfills the Hanafi school's conditions, integrals, and requisites, which for Shafi'is can best be assured by performing all the Shafi'i recommended measures and sunnahs for purification and prayer as though obligatory, and then checking if possible with a knowledgeable Hanafi to make sure one has done everything needed for legal validity. It is not necessary that he be free of minor or even major impurity, janaba, at the time the dressing is applied.
Which is different from the Hanafi school and the Shafi'i school. Here, the other thing is uh, the other thing is whenever you're taking a dispensation from another school, as he mentions the Hanafi school, you should ensure that all the conditions and integrals and avoid all the invalidators in that school, right? So when you don't just say I'm following Hanafi and you don't observe the conditions, the integrals, and the invalidators in the Hanafi school. So whenever you take a dispensation from another school, any school, you should make sure you learn the rules to that act of worship in that school. Is that point clear? Uh, and I know this is the hardest thing. Listen, for many of us, we have to follow a school. Please get that in your mind. If you want your acts of worship to be valid and accepted by the agreement of this ummah, you must follow a school of thought. Other than that, you're all over the place and you may be performing acts of worship in an invalid manner and not know it, which is the case often because people learn to pray, but they don't know the rules of prayer. So they have a form, but the rules they know nothing about. And therefore, by not knowing those rules, the form may be invalidated, right? There are rules and a lot of details to rules, especially with al-fiqh. You need to do it over and over and over and over again. Why? Because the amount of the rules, you will forget. You will make mistakes. Unless you're constantly reviewing, it's going to happen, right? Because your life has events all the time. Things are happening, right? And if you don't review and you don't, you know, every now and then check the cases, you're going to forget them, right? It's very important to understand that. Go ahead.
There is strong evidence for performing dry ablution in place of washing such an injury. To add it at the proper point of the ablution sequence as a precautionary measure would not interfere with the validity of following the Hanafi position just discussed.
Mhm.
Menstruation and
All right, we'll
postnatal.
stop there. I don't know why. Something in my mind tells me I missed something in this section, but I don't even know what it is, right? So tomorrow we're going to read this section over. Something's in my mind, but I can't identify what I left out. Or, oh, I think I said that you wipe over it, but that's in addition to performing at that point dry ablution at tayammum, and that's why it's mentioned. So read 226 again, the first paragraph.
If one has a bandage or cast, per translator, on a part of the body normally washed in ablution, a dressing that one cannot remove without causing oneself harm, one wipes it with water. Per translator, per lines of the traveler, when one comes to it in the ablution sequence, in addition to performing a complete dry ablution, per lines of the traveler, at that point.
And that's the point that I think when I was talking about something else, and I didn't add that point, even though you read it. That you do in the Shafi'i school have to make a tayammum, and that's why it's mentioned when you have that bandage on the places where you normally would make al wudu, right? And then in the Hanafi school, the ruling is different. Why? Because in the Shafi'i school, you need to have you need to be in ablution when you put it on, whereas in the Hanafi school, you don't. Mm. Now, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. Mm. So read this case over again today, and tomorrow we want to just review this case again. My mind is seeming kind of foggy, so I want to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. So we're going to review this case again tomorrow. So read uh, the section of Sahibul Jabira, the one who has a bandage on the place of wudu. I want to, there's a lot of details because I remember when I studied this with my teachers, there was a lot of details. And this is summarized, and maybe those details keep coming into my mind while reading a summary. So I need to just organize it in my brain. Barakallahu bikum. There's no questions? Let me say one thing, right? And I know sometimes with myself, I want to share this with you. I'm very sensitive to what has been done to us as a people. If one is not in Tahara, one needs to repeat those prayers. Yes, one needs to repeat those prayers. If one was not in the state of purification when the bandage was put on. Um, so my point is that uh, there's a lot of things that has happened to us as a people as a result of others benefiting off of our lack of knowledge and access. And we've been suffering from that, and still to this day are suffering from that for almost a century. So when you hear me sometimes respond to certain things, the way I respond is based on that knowledge. I'm working on that, but it's like it's really, really troubling to me. A number has been done on us, and sometimes when a number is done on you, it takes a while for you to recover, right? So we actually have to free ourselves from that. Like really, like almost outright rejection, right? And then the process is to realize you did a number on me. So I got to redo all that stuff. And that's hard, right? That's hard. The slave master teaches you how to be a slave. So that even when he's not over you, you still act and think like a slave. The slave master teaches the slave how to be a slave. to the extent that even when the slave master is not present, the slave will still act like a slave, will think like a slave, and will act like a slave, even when the slave master is no longer around. Do you understand my point? And a lot of times, due to our lack of knowledge and our lack of access, those who had a little bit of knowledge and more access enslaved us. And now that we're free from them, but we still think and act like they taught us, which is we have to reject it. Right? And that's complete rebellion. But you know how it go. We can't rebel against boss. He'll kill us. Don't get too uppity, Negro. You know, that type of mentality. We got that in Islam. It's obvious that we've been hoodwinked. That's obvious. That ain't even something to think about, right? Now doing something about it is the difficult part, right? We have to learn to walk on our own. And when you learn to walk on your own, sometimes you're going to fall. Don't be afraid of that. But your parents can't hold you forever. They have to let you go. You got to learn to walk. And sometimes you walk, you're going to bump, scrape your knees. That's going to happen, right? But eventually, you're going to walk straight up, and you might walk and run better than the ones who was teaching you how to walk, right? So when you ever hear me like certain responses, the way I respond, it's due to that. I have a complete rejection of subjugation in the deen from people who didn't have our best interests. I have a complete rejection of that stuff because I've studied enough to realize we've been hoodwinked. It's not our tradition. It's just people. People saw us as a means to achieve their objectives. And we were willing participants because we wanted knowledge and we wanted salvation. So it jacked our communities up, seriously, to the point we can't even function together. That's how bad it was, right? We can't even function together. They strategically ripped us a shreds. Does that make sense? Ripped us apart, ripped us to shreds, and left us broken. While they built and established, and if you see what they did with all of our labor, you really would be angry. If you see what people did with all our labor and our resources in the name of Islam, you would be extremely upset. But some of us are still like, no, boss didn't do that. Yeah, boss did do that. You know it. You know? And we got to fix it. We got to fix it. Don't do the next generation like that. And I'm saying that because I know sometimes my responses seem kind of sharp. Or at least I feel. Maybe they're not, right? But I feel sometimes I'm like a little bit too sharp. But I'm telling you, we have to get that knee off our neck. Religiously speaking, we have to get their knee off our necks. It's not just Wahhabism. It's not just Wahhabism. So your question, if I can read it, one day, when possible for you, can you point out the specific areas of serious concern that we need to know regarding how we have been misled by Wahhabism? I know you have covered this as the differences come up in a discussion, but listing the flaws with explanations of what we have been taught improperly could help us tremendously. Inshallah, we've done it before, and inshallah, we'll do it again. But don't think I'm not even talking about Wahhabism right now. I'm talking about something. I'm talking about in the name of Ahl Sunnah. what has been done to black people. I'm not just talking about Wahhabism. No, 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 no. I'm talking about serious issues. That's why we don't have real Sunni communities. Don't you notice that? You haven't noticed that it's very difficult to find traditional black Sunni communities? You see how hard that is? That they're really Ahl Sunnah 100% with the proper books, chains of narrations, scholars. That's still hard to find in our communities. They're not a lot. And especially unapologetic. 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 Not many. That's by design. That's by design. That's not no like accident. That's by design, right? And then some of them made it that those who have the knowledge hate the other ones. And they gave them recipes so that you never work with your people. You never work with them. You'll never help them. No, serious stuff. Serious stuff. I know it firsthand. And it's sad, but it's the number that's been played on us, right? So we have to fix it. And it's one of the reasons I do what I do. Because honestly, I don't feel qualified. But it's a necessity. We don't have no choice. We have to do it. Because if we rely on somebody else, it ain't going to happen. That stuff will continue. And maybe just one voice or two voices or three voices, 4 or 5 voices will be enough to motivate us for the next generation. Right? Right? So you got to do the work. You know, you got to do the work. And the thing is, if we learn enough, we'll see it. Right? We'll see it. I'm telling you, man, people be running game on us. It's always a double standard when it comes to us. It's just real stuff. I don't want to get into all this, right? You got my point. Is my point clear? For most of you who've been watching, sometimes you don't need to point everything out specifically, but it's clear that we ain't get a fair shake. That's clear, right? You've been learning enough in all this time to know we ain't got a fair shake. We ain't special. I'm talking about us as teachers. We ain't like we some special, super smart people and we came up with something that no one else ever knew. No, we just discovered what you've been hiding from us. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. We should have all had this stuff, but y'all been hiding it from us and using it for your benefit while subjugating us. This stuff ain't some new stuff that, man, this guy's so smart. He came up with all that. No, he didn't. You've been hiding it from us. That's what it is. You've been taking care of yourself and forgetting us. Bottom line. You've been building institutions off our back while we've been suffering. It is what it is. So don't go to sleep and start thinking, oh, because I'm Sunni, everybody got my best interest. No, you still black and you still getting the same stuff. It's just in another form. It ain't changed. And when you realize that it will change, when you realize that, hey, this dude playing games. When you realize that, then you'll do what you got to do. I could tell you some horror stories about this stuff of people who are supposed to be people of knowledge, how they've been treated and subjugated. Right? All right, this is way off the topic. I'm sorry. But so when you hear my responses like that, you understand why. That's all. I'm only saying that to sometimes when I like come like boom, it's a reason. Barakallahu bikum. May Allah reward y'all. We'll see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.